Born a slave, he would, in death, make the entire Roman Empire tremble. 6,000 crosses lined the Appian Way all the way to the gates of Rome, all to erase a single name, Spartacus. The story begins in the 1st century BCE. At the dawn of Christianity, a great faith, one that sought to overthrow the pagan tyranny of Rome and establish a new society, was quietly taking shape. Rome, at the time, was the center of the civilized world. Poets hailed it as the Golden Rome, the fairest land in the realm of the gods. Yet beneath its glittering surface, the empire was rotting from within, infected by a fatal disease, slavery. In that same century, Rome conquered the Greek province of Thrace. A nameless slave woman, illiterate and enslaved, bore her master a son. She named him Spartacus. Proud and defiant, the boy was sold to the mines of Libya at just 12 years old, a hell on earth. There, he spent his youth under the scorching sun and the lash of the overseers, but in his heart, he dreamed of the day slavery would end. One day, Spartacus saw a fellow slave collapse from exhaustion. Without hesitation, he dropped the stones he carried and lifted the fallen man onto his back. But this act of kindness was seen as defiance by the overseers. They beat him to the ground, crushing his ankle under their boots, and sentenced him to death.
Spartacus again, huh? Well, this time he died.
Just then, a man named Batiatus, a lanista, gladiator trainer, arrived at the mines to select slaves. He scoffed at the broken men, complaining that the Gauls were too hairy, the others too weak. As he prepared to leave, his eye caught a man hanging from the rocks, barely alive. Batiatus approached and saw that, despite his wounds, the slave's muscles were still firm. When he tried to check the man's teeth, the slave Spartacus refused to open his mouth. The overseer smirked and told Batiatus that this one was special. An hour earlier, he had bitten through a guard's tendon. Intrigued by his ferocity, Batiatus bought him on the spot. Spartacus and a group of slaves were taken to Batiatus's gladiator school. There, Batiatus painted a picture of their bright future.
Here you will be trained by experts to fight in pairs to the death. Obviously, you won't be required to fight to the death here. That'll only be after you've been sold. And then for ladies and gentlemen of quality, those who appreciate a fine kill. The gladiator's like a stallion, must be pampered. You'll be oiled, bathed, shaved, massaged, taught to use your heads.
Those who performed well might earn the company of women, or even the distant promise of freedom. He instructed the head trainer, Marcellus, to correct Spartacus's spirit, but not to break him, for he saw potential in the young slave. Training began.
What's your name, slave?
Spartacus. I feel you don't like me.
Marcellus tried to humiliate Spartacus into submission, handing him a real sword while wielding only a wooden one. He taunted him, provoking an attack. Spartacus ignored him and refused to fight. Marcellus took back the sword, acknowledging Spartacus's intelligence but warning him that such defiance was dangerous for a slave. That night, in the filthy baths, another gladiator warned Spartacus that Marcellus had marked him. When Spartacus asked the man's name, the gladiator replied that gladiators didn't need friends, because one day they might face each other in the arena, and he wouldn't hesitate to kill. Soon, Batiatus rewarded his best gladiators with women. A girl named Varinia was assigned to Spartacus. In the dim light of his cell, faced with this stranger, Spartacus felt something he never had before: shame. Outside, Marcellus and the others laughed and jeered, treating the scene as entertainment. Spartacus roared in anger, declaring he was not an animal.
I'm not an animal! I'm not an animal.
Neither am I.
In that moment, two broken souls found a fragile connection. But Marcellus quickly took Varinia away, sneering that Spartacus wasn't even a real man. From then on, Spartacus trained harder than ever. His heart burned not only for freedom, but for something, or someone, he dared to care for. Marcellus painted targets on Spartacus's body, teaching him where to strike for death or maiming. He noticed Spartacus stealing glances at Varinia in the kitchen and seized the opportunity to humiliate him further, forcing him to stare at her in front of the others.
Since all you can do is look at girls. All right, slave. Go ahead and look.
That night, just as Spartacus thought he would finally have a moment alone with Varinia, Marcellus took her away again, this time assigning her to another man. In the oppressive mess hall, their paths crossed once more. Spartacus asked if she was hurt. Varinia shook her head. A simple exchange, yet, in the darkness, it was the only flicker of light. That day, one of Rome's most powerful generals, Crassus, arrived unannounced at the gladiator school with two noblewomen in tow. Batiatus, flattered by the attention, groveled before them. The women's request was simple and brutal. They wanted to witness a real fight to the death. At first, Batiatus hesitated, unwilling to lose his valuable property, but the promise of a fortune quickly changed his mind. In the dungeons, word spread, and both Spartacus and the gladiator Draba sensed something was wrong. Soon, the slaves were dragged into the arena like cattle, their lives at the mercy of the women's whims. One noblewoman, Helena, dismissed the muscular tiger and instead chose Spartacus, who appeared weak. Her companions selected Draba, the school's strongest gladiator, to face him. Before the fight began, Varinia, while serving wine, accidentally spilled a cup. Crassus, however, took an interest in the educated Briton slave and decided to buy her on the spot. The first pair of gladiators fought and died, to the cheers of the crowd. Then, it was Spartacus's turn. Outmatched, he was quickly ensnared by Draba's trident and net. Just as everyone assumed his death was certain, Draba hesitated. He looked at the fallen Spartacus and, in a final act of defiance, hurled his trident at Crassus in the stands. Draba's rebellion cost him his life. His body was strung up in the mess hall, a silent accusation against the system. Spartacus watched helplessly as Varinia was taken away in a carriage bound for Rome. Rage and despair ignited a fire within him. That night, he killed the cook who had mocked him, sparking a full-scale slave revolt. The gladiators broke free, slaughtered Marcellus, and seized control of the school. Like a tidal wave, they surged toward Rome, the symbol of their oppression. News of the uprising reached the Roman Senate, sending the senators into a panic. Crassus's political rival, Gracchus, seized the opportunity, proposing that Crassus's protege, Glabris, lead the Roman garrison to crush the rebellion. In the process, Gracchus ensured that command of Rome's defenses would fall to his ally, the young Caesar. Meanwhile, Crassus was enjoying a gift from the Sicilian governor, a group of young male slaves. He took a particular liking to a poetic singer named Antoninus, making him his personal attendant. Glabris arrived, eager to share his good fortune, only to be met with Crassus's fury.
Do you think I made you commander of the garrison to control some rock patch on Vesuvius? It was to control the streets of Rome.
I only take 6 cohorts. The rest of the garrison remain.
Under whose command?
Under Caesar's.
Oh, excellent.
Though enraged, Crassus adhered to aristocratic tradition and refused to march his legions into Rome. He could only watch as Glabris handed over command. Crassus ordered Glabris to cancel the farewell ceremony and leave the city under cover of darkness. The escaped slaves, now free, established themselves in the hills. Spartacus put a stop to their violent games, swearing that as long as he lived, such tragedies would never repeat. He proposed a bold plan: to forge an unstoppable army of gladiators, liberate every slave along their path, and escape Italy by sea, crossing the Alps to freedom. They would buy ships from the Cilician pirates, Rome's enemies. Spartacus's speech ignited hope in the hearts of his followers. They chanted his name, as if freedom itself were within reach. At that moment, Spartacus unexpectedly reunited with Varinia, who had escaped. Batiatus, terrified by the rebel army, had fled, and Varinia had seized her chance to jump from the carriage.
I thought I'd never see you again.
Everything's so different. The last time I saw you were waiting in the arena.
The two embraced in the midst of chaos, their love blooming even in the fire of war. Meanwhile, the bankrupt Batiatus sought out Gracchus, weeping as he recounted his misfortunes and blaming Crassus for everything. He revealed that Varinia was now with Spartacus. Batiatus reminded Gracchus that Crassus had not yet paid for the slaves. Gracchus saw an opportunity and decided to buy Varinia himself, using the purchase as a way to humiliate Crassus. Meanwhile, in his luxurious bath, Crassus engaged Antoninus in a discussion about the moral virtues of oysters and snails, subtly hinting at his own unconventional tastes. He showcased Rome's power to the young poet, insisting that serving Rome was the only path to survival. The psychological oppression and veiled threats terrified Antoninus, who chose to flee. Antoninus escaped to Spartacus's camp. Though he could sing, perform magic, and recite poetry, his only desire was to fight. Spartacus admired his talent and initially wanted him to teach the others to sing. Varinia, however, told Spartacus she liked the poet because singing and poetry were more valuable than learning to fight. Spartacus, now a free man but illiterate, confessed his longing to understand the world.
Now you teach us to sing.
Varinia described the wind to him poetically as the sigh of a distant god, yearning for a girl. Soon, Tigranes Levantus, an envoy from the Cilician pirates, arrived at the camp. Spartacus struck a deal. In 7 months, the pirates would provide 500 ships to transport the slave army out of Italy. But Tigranes also brought grim news. Glabris and the Roman garrison were closing in.
Bargains in my name, may I...
Spartacus saw an opportunity. To him, death was not a loss for slaves, but liberation. This fearlessness was their strength. Scouts reported that Glabris's arrogant army had not even built defenses. Spartacus decided to launch a night raid, seizing the weapons and supplies the Romans had carelessly left within reach. The rebel army struck like a storm. The unprepared Roman camp was engulfed in flames. Glabris, captured in the chaos, had been commanding his troops by playing dead. Spartacus spared his life, sending him back to Rome with the fasces, the symbol of Roman authority, as a message to the Senate. They sought only freedom and wanted to leave Italy in peace. Glabris's humiliating defeat sent shockwaves through the Senate. Crassus publicly denounced him, exiling him and using the moment to retire from military command, a strategic retreat. Gracchus saw through the ploy, recognizing Crassus's true ambition: dictatorship. Meanwhile, Varinia revealed to Spartacus that she was pregnant. The child, due in spring, filled him with hope and an unfamiliar vulnerability.
Yet sometimes, even with you here sleeping beside me, I feel so alone. I imagine a God for slaves, and I pray.
What do you pray for?
I pray for a son who'll be born free.
I pray for the same thing.
Spartacus's army continued its unstoppable march south, crushing 2 more Roman legions at Pandosia. Panic gripped Rome as the Senate floundered. Crassus saw his chance. He demanded to be appointed first consul and supreme commander of Italy, promising to restore order through dictatorship. Gracchus initially refused, but he knew that if Spartacus could not be stopped, the Senate would eventually surrender to Crassus's demands. To thwart Crassus's rise, Gracchus secretly negotiated with the Cilician pirates, securing their promise to transport the slaves out of Italy without Roman interference. Finally, Spartacus's army reached the coast. Freedom seemed within grasp, until Tigranes returned with devastating news. Pompey and Lucullus had landed, preparing to attack from both flanks. Worse, the Cilician fleet had been bribed by Crassus and withdrawn. Spartacus realized he had been outmaneuvered. With no escape, his only choice was to march on Rome. This played directly into Crassus's hands. He was now legally appointed first magistrate and supreme commander, wielding absolute power.
I promise you a new Rome, a new Italy, and a new empire. I promise the destruction of the slave army and the restoration of order throughout all our territory.
Traveled a long ways together. We fought many battles, won great victories. Now, instead of taking ship for our homes across the sea, we must fight again. Maybe there's no peace in this world, for us or for anyone else. I don't know, but I do know that as long as we live, we must stay true to ourselves. I do know that we're brothers, and I know that we're free. We march tonight!
The stage was set for the final battle, a clash that would decide the fate of Rome and its slaves. Crassus assembled every Roman legion, allied with Pompey's forces, and laid an inescapable trap. He summoned Betrayal solely to identify Spartacus's appearance. His goal was not just to destroy the rebel army, but to erase Spartacus's legend entirely. On the eve of battle, Spartacus's camp was filled with a somber, heroic resolve. The battle erupted as the rebel army set massive carts ablaze, sending a river of fire surging toward the Roman ranks. Driven by their desperate longing for freedom, the slaves charged through the flames, clashing in brutal hand-to-hand combat with the well-armed Roman legions. But against overwhelming numbers and superior tactics, the slave army was steadily pushed back. Lucullus and Pompey's forces closed in from both flanks, trapping the rebels in a deadly pincer. The once mighty uprising was crushed beneath the iron heels of Rome's legions. After the battle, Crassus ordered the survivors to identify Spartacus in exchange for their lives. Silence fell, until one voice rose.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus!
Every slave present chose to stand with their leader, even in death. Crassus's plan failed. He could not find Spartacus, but he did discover Varinia and her child. He took them back to his home in Rome and condemned the remaining slaves to crucifixion. Spartacus and Antoninus were saved for last. Crassus returned to Rome in triumph, announcing Gracchus's exile as an act of mercy and demanding his service to the new order. He sought to conquer Varinia, not just her body, but her heart, hoping to ease his fear of Spartacus by possessing what the rebel leader loved. Outside the city, Crassus forced Spartacus and Antoninus into a duel to the death, with the winner doomed to the cross.
I love you, Spartacus, as I loved my own father. I love you like my son that I'll never see.
To spare his friend the prolonged agony of crucifixion, Spartacus killed Antoninus. He told Crassus that his true victory lay in rebellion itself. Spartacus's spirit would never die. As Spartacus was nailed to the cross, Crassus taunted him, revealing that Varinia and her child were now his slaves, aiming to crush Spartacus's spirit completely. But Gracchus had not surrendered. He bribed Betrayal with 1,000,000 sesterces, rescuing Varinia and her son and granting them freedom. As they fled Rome, their carriage passed along the Appian Way. Varinia saw Spartacus barely alive, nailed to his cross. She lifted their freeborn son so he could see his father one last time. She whispered that their son would always remember him and his dream. Spartacus, gazing into the eyes of his love, died in peace, his hope for freedom alive in their hearts. The carriage rolled on, carrying Spartacus's bloodline and unyielding spirit toward the distant horizon of liberty.
Goodbye, my love.